Hello everybody, welcome to week 12 of Introduction to Communication Studies. This week our lesson deals with intercultural communications. Communication relies on shared understandings about conventions and context for conversation. And as long as we have a shared understanding of a language or shared understanding of what certain ideas mean or how we should conduct a conversation, then we're able to have a fluent conversation together. However, if two people were to come together with different cultural backgrounds, different understandings of communication, it could create a roadblock to communication. This week we're talking about intercultural communication. And intercultural communication is when two cultures come together and attempt to communicate, and there are certainly roadblocks that can exist to that kind of communication. Now, first of all, let's define what a culture is. Culture is, according to your book, that part of the environment made by humans. According to that definition, culture includes everything, all the material objects and possessions that a social group invents or acquires. Even more importantly, it includes the group's less tangible creations, the shared customs and values that bind its members together and give them a sense of community. So culture includes a group's collective answer to the fundamental question, who are we? What is our place in the world? How are we to live our lives? That is the place from which shared understanding comes. We have a shared idea of who we are as Americans. We have a shared idea of what our place is in the world. Now, we may nuance it a little differently, and we may have little different ideas and opinions, but when it all boils down, we have a shared understanding of what America's place in the world should be. And then, of course, how do we live our lives? We live our lives according to our culture, and our culture is our template for living. It gives us certain basic ideas of the way we should conduct ourselves. And so let's talk about some characteristics of culture. First of all, cultures are learned. We learn how to interact in our culture. We learn how to relate to our culture. Much of our early childhood and early training is an attempt to make us fit into a cultural pattern, and we adapt to that, and our thought processes, our work habits, the way we conduct ourselves, the way we do things. So even the way you answer the phone is established by the culture in which you live. And we're so well programmed that we seldom stop to think that culture is something we learned. There are cultural norms that drive our activities and our behaviors, and those cultural norms appear to us to be normal and natural and right, and we can't imagine ever acting any differently or anyone else acting any differently. Yet if we'd been brought up in another culture, in another place, with another set of cultural values, we would think and behave quite differently than we do now. And so culture is definitely a learned experience. It's a learned structure. It's something that we adapt to. Another thing about culture is that it is shared. Cultures are group understandings rather than individual understandings. And belonging to a culture means acting according to group norms. For most people, fitting into a culture group is very important. We find security in others like us, and we tend to divide the world into us and them categories. And we work very hard at making sure that others recognize which one we are. We are an us, not a them. And there is a them that is separate from us. So because cultures are shared understandings, we're not entirely free to just do whatever we want to do. The process of living in a culture has to do with conforming to group norms and conforming to the culture in which you live. And those rules are sometimes invisible, and sometimes we'd never recognize them as long as we stay in our culture. But when you step outside of your culture, if you ever have the opportunity to operate on the foreign field, or you get to visit a foreign country where they speak a different language, where they have different characteristics and different ways of conducting themselves, you're going to quickly discover that Their cultural rules are different than our cultural rules, and you're going to experience a certain amount of distance between you and that culture, and there's going to be a certain amount of culture shock and a certain amount of adapting that has to be done, and then and only then will you truly see how much your culture affects you. Another characteristic of the cultures is that they are multifaceted. If we define culture as everything that surrounds us that is not natural or biological in character, then culture clearly has many facets. At a minimum, culture affects language, religion, basic worldview, education, social organization, technology, politics, law, and all of those things affect one another. So we are living in a multifaceted culture. We interact with different cultures ourselves. We are members of different culture groups. There are some activities and understandings that are found in virtually every culture in the world. Those activities are common to all people who live together in social groups, and we call those things cultural universals. And table 12.1 in your book details some of those cultural universals. Another characteristic of cultures is that they are dynamic. They are constantly changing as economic conditions change, as new technologies are developed, as cultural contact increases. Old ways of doing things change, and people have to learn new behaviors. That's one reason why you can't just learn a list of do's and don'ts for a culture, because that list of do's and don'ts will change and it will adapt with time. And you're going to have to, rather than learning a list of do's and don'ts, you need to just learn to be sensitive to the kind of differences that occur between cultures and develop the ability to learn by observing. That's how you assimilate into a culture. I said just a moment ago that cultures are multifaceted, and another characteristic of cultures that relates to that is that cultural identities are overlapping. We belong to multiple overlapping cultures, some of which work together and some of which work in conflict. At a minimum, we all belong to national, regional, class, ethnic, religious, professional, age, and gender cultures. At various times, one or more of these identities becomes crucial while the rest fade into the background. Given that intercultural communications can be a difficult thing, you may ask, why even study it? Why even talk about it? Why should we even be concerned with it? And there are several reasons why it matters. First of all, the world is shrinking, and we live in a global village where intercultural encounters are unavoidable. At some time, you're going to come into communication with another culture, and you need to be skilled in learn how to adapt to that, how to adjust to that, especially if you're going to end up in some type of multicultural ministry, or perhaps you're considering missionary opportunities. If you're going to end up operating overseas or ministering overseas or taking a job overseas or even just traveling overseas on vacation, at some point you're going to encounter other cultures, and you're going to find yourself in a place where you need to communicate with people whose beliefs, values, and ways of living are vastly different from yours. The greater then your understanding of intercultural communication is, the richer that experience will be. If you have a desire to go into missions work, intercultural communications is one of the places that you should devote some time and energy to studying, because it's important that you learn to communicate with the culture that you're going to try to take the gospel to. However, even if you don't travel abroad, we live in a country of many coexisting cultures. There are Americans from all kinds of diverse backgrounds, religious backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, and it's becoming increasingly difficult, to ignore the presence of co-cultures within our own community. There are immigrant groups that come in and they establish their own culture. They establish their own little circle. And even in America, even in small town America, you can experience foreign cultures. You can encounter cultural barriers and cultural differences. And even when we speak the same language and we come from the same country and we're not immigrants, we still may find cultural differences between the North and the South, and the way they do things in one state as opposed to the way they do things in another state. We all have to learn to live in harmony with our neighbors, and we have to learn to overcome the differences that are between us. And intercultural communication is about adapting to that cultural diversity.